Perhaps some of you, like myself, have wondered at times, is there really a place for me? Is there a place for me in the church in particular? We look at our lives perhaps and we can see mistakes that have been made. Maybe we've been away from the church for a period of time. Maybe our life hasn't turned out the way that we expected it to. Maybe we look around and we see that everybody else seems to have their stuff together and I'm just not quite there. Perhaps you've had some of those kinds of thinkings at different times. But yet we hear in our first reading today with the prophet Isaiah, God's house will be a house of prayer for all peoples. Not just for the people that have everything together and are so pious and so holy, which good for those people, but for everyone. Regardless of whether we fully believe or whether we're having doubts, whether we struggle in some kind of way, whether we have challenges in our lives that maybe we aren't living exactly the life that, God hopes for us, whether we're successful or not successful, old, young, prominent, not prominent, whatever it might be, all, God says in our first reading, my house of prayer is for all peoples. And how consoling that is, to know that when we gather in this space, it's for everyone. We may not see always eye to eye on things. Like I said, different people might be at different spots on their journey, but we can all come here in that sense of we are all welcomed, or we should feel welcomed. That's why tonight, with our festival happening that our summer students have put together, it's that sense of gathering everyone. Everyone is a part of our gathering. Many of our ministries tonight are being done by our young people, which, for some people, those young people are doing good for them. How wonderful that is. Because they too are welcome. They too are part of our community in the same way that the elderly and the others along the way are all part of that. And that's why it's such a celebration today, that when we're gathering as a people of prayer in a house of prayer. We gather to worship, we gather for an opportunity to spend some fellowship and time and meal, and then we'll have some time where we'll be able to be with Jesus. A Jesus that maybe sometimes we felt that we were on the outside. Maybe we felt like this Canaanite woman in our gospel today, crying out, hey, Jesus, hello, I'm here. And he, by the sounds of the gospel, he seemed to ignore her. And she kept shouting and got to the point where the disciples were saying, hey, Jesus, tell this lady to get lost. She's just causing a stir here. And maybe you felt that way sometimes. Maybe the prayers that you've offered to the Lord, it sounds like he doesn't seem to be hearing you. And that's where we have to be like the Canaanite woman and say, yep, it's okay for me to be here, and it's okay for me to keep pleading to the Lord. I have to be persistent. And it's her persistence ultimately that allows her prayer to be heard. But even in her persistence, initially Jesus gives her a little bit of a challenge. Okay, I'm going to acknowledge you, but nope, I came for the house of Israel. And then she says that beautiful line, but yes, even the scraps that fall from the master's table, are fine for the dogs. And Jesus saw there was something much deeper going on there. And he drew that out of her, anticipating that, knowing what Jesus knows. And maybe sometimes that's what Jesus is doing with each one of us. We may not fully understand why he has not seemed to have heard us at this point. Maybe he's challenging us to grow in some kind of way. And that's why we have to keep at it. Because I do not doubt for a moment that, yes, Jesus always does hear. How he responds, that, as we know and as we've shared before, is sometimes a different situation. But he does hear. And maybe he is inviting us to grow in our faith. Maybe he is challenging us to really seek him in a different way. And that's where, as we're doing tonight, adoration is so important for us when we're in those times and even when we're not in those times. And when we have Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, in the monstrance, on the altar, you get to sit there and just look at him Share whatever is in your heart. He's right there, waiting to hear what's going on in your life. He already knows, but it's important that we share, and we're comfortable enough to share. We're comfortable enough to cry out to him, Lord, help me. That's what the woman did in our gospel today. 3 simple words, Lord, help me. Lord, help me grow in my faith. Lord, help me with the difficulty that I'm having. Lord, help a person that I'm concerned about. Lord, give me some direction in my life. I have so many options available, and I'm feeling I'm being tugged this way or that way. And whatever it is, we can just spend there in silence and just look at him, and he looks at you, and you can silently have that conversation. And a key part of any time that I recommend when you're having an opportunity to be part of adoration is don't talk the whole time. And that's why I always encourage, whenever there's an adoration hour or holy hour, make sure that it's not all music, not all scripture and reflection and all that. Make sure there's some time for silence so we can talk to Jesus, and at some point, zip it up and allow Jesus to talk to you. Let Jesus speak to your heart as he's looking at you. You're looking at him. Let him speak to your heart. That's what we have happening today, tonight. But that's not just unique to tonight. These opportunities are there at different times. And we're very blessed to have an adoration, our Eucharistic chapel here at Good Shepherd. How many of you take advantage of that? Spend some time with Jesus. He's always there in the tabernacle. You can always tell the light's on. When the candle is on, Jesus is in. It's like Motel 6 or whatever. We'll leave the light on. Jesus is always there. The light's always on. But are you there? Am I there? A place of prayer where God welcomes everyone. Whatever your struggle, whatever your success that you want to share with him, he's there. And so maybe that's part of what we can reflect upon today as we continue our journey. Do we recognize that, yes, all of us are welcome? The house of prayer, prayer to the Lord is for everyone, and he does hear. Are we patient enough, persistent enough to wait for the answer?